Hello, everyone. Welcome to Lunch Break Science. And happy belated World Chimpanzee Day. While it was earlier this week, the celebration continues. I am Ariel Johnson from the Leakey Foundation, and today we explore chimp play and gaze following. Be sure to let us know where you're tuning in from in the chat or video description. And if you want to be a part of the next great discovery, we have special opportunities for your donations to be doubled, so check out our YouTube giving fundraiser or website. Today, Leakey Foundation grantee Dr. Kris Sabbi joins us from the East Coast of the US, where she is college fellow in the Department of Evolutionary Biology at Harvard. You can also find Kris in the field in Kibale National Park in Uganda, where she studies the Kanyawara group of chimpanzees. Here we are zooming in and gonna have a amazing video footage of some of the chimpanzees there. Kris, thank you so much for being here with us. Kris,
thank you so much for having me.
Oh, yeah. The last time we saw you, or I guess the last time you were on Lunch Break Science, you talked about several of your projects and gave us a little glimpse into Chimp 101. Let's actually take a look at a clip from that episode.
Now, first thing is that there are a few things you need to know about chimps. So there are close evolutionary cousins, and they have really big brains, and they live in large communities and have a sort of fairly fluid fission-fusion grouping system where the larger community breaks up and comes back together over time. Now, males and females use different social strategies, with females spending most of their time alone or with just their offspring, and males forming the sort of central bonds of the group. And males use physical aggression much more frequently than females, and they do this to organize themselves into linear dominance hierarchies. But they also cooperate with each other for things like territory defense and hunting. Like humans, chimps take a very long time to grow up, which makes them great for unraveling developmental processes, both in their own right and also as a comparative species for understanding human evolution and development.
It was such a great, just kind of brief introduction. Is there anything that you'd like to add about chimps that we need to know?
Yeah, so in terms of some of the things that we're going to talk about today, another thing that I would add on to sort of the end of that clip. So obviously I spend a lot of time thinking about development and developmental questions and social learning. And some of the reasons that chimpanzees need to spend a really long time growing up is because they have these really complex social systems. And that includes a lot of aspects of gestural communication, vocal communication, learning their social roles and their social environments. And so that's why they spend a lot of time watching each other. And, they, instead of the way that humans sort of, we call it like active teaching, like we set up these situations where we explain how to do things and explain what kids need to know, and spend a lot of time correcting their behavior and making sure they're getting it right. Chimpanzees are mostly learning by watching, observing. It's very learner directed. So it's very much like they're figuring things out from the environment around them and what they can see.
Well, thank you for that kind of overview. And thank you so much for joining us, Pete, Lori, Sears, James, Keith, Penina, Alex, and Lindsay. It's great to see you all here. And just welcome to everyone else watching. Again, we're celebrating chimpanzees today, and we're going to be sharing next our most popular lunch break science clip from our very first episode.
And I always like to start talks about chimpanzee communication by actually telling you a little bit about one of my favorite chimpanzee vocalizations called a pant hoot. And this is one of my favorite calls. It's one of the calls that when we're out in the forest with the chimpanzees, we hear it actually quite frequently. So it's a commonly given signal, and it can be quite loud. And so we'll hear it even from far away, from a mile or two away in the forest. And it's a really interesting talk and call. And I'm going to pant hoot for you. If you put it all together, it sounds a little bit like this, which is So that's my not necessarily very accurate pant hoot. A chimpanzee would not necessarily think that I was a chimp, but I think you hopefully could hear all 4 parts. And now I'm going to just actually play a video so you can hear and see what chimpanzees look like when they're pant hooting. And the thing about this video to just pay attention to, you'll actually see 2 chimps together pant hooting. And then if you wait till after they pant hoot, you'll hear other chimps farther away responding to them.
So that was your colleague Zareen Machanda, and that is only just one of like numerous vocalizations chimpanzees make. What is your favorite chimpanzee vocalization?
Ooh, well, I mean, I'll start by admitting that even if it was a pant hoot, I can't pant hoot nearly as well as Zareen can. I think she's fantastic at it. But for me, I love chimpanzee laughter. It's like one of those vocalizations that it's like no matter how hard the day has been, no matter, what swamp you've trekked through and how awful it's been, if they're in the mood and they're playing and they're laughing, it's like impossible for you not to be happy as well. It's very, very sweet.
So I think we have a clip of some laughter. So we can...
Yeah, so as you're watching that clip, so two fun facts. One is that the individual from the previous video where Zareen was showing that pant hoot, this is the same individual actually laughing several years later. But so yeah, same guy being our sort of our vocal example here. And you can hear that like just really breathy. So this is 2 adult males playing with each other. They're like playing a little game of ring around the tree and they're just having a really great time. You can tell from their really relaxed expressions. They're making play faces. They're both laughing at each other and they're just having a great time.
Well, speaking of play, a few months ago, you published a really fascinating article on play. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it? Because it was a really, it was a really great read. And we'll share a link to the article in the chat.
Yeah, I'd love to. So, okay, so what's really, really fun about this paper for me is if you think back to that Chimp 101 clip, one of the things that I said is like, one of the big things about chimpanzees that we know is that females are usually much less gregarious, so much less social than males. And when you have a look at sort of adult behavior, adults behaving and interacting with other adults, that's really true. Adult females spend a lot of time by themselves, especially when food availability is low. And so what we were looking at in this paper is how food availability changes how often adults are playing at all, because it's a pretty expensive behavior. So, we might see that clip of Makoku playing with Bud when food is really great. But we wanted to know what happens when the sort of food disappears, because that really, it can impact our understanding of the function of play and how it evolved. And it can really impact the way that we understand, how often these things are happening. And so my favorite result from this study is that what we wound up finding is that adult females are actually engaged in more play more often than adult males. So here's this one sort of way that they're a little bit more gregarious than adult males. And for the reason for that is because they're so often playing with their children. Now, with their offspring, with their infants and their juvenile offspring. Now, what this clip is showing is what happened one summer when the food was so good that the females were even playing with each other, sort of to the exclusion of their little infants. So you can see both of these females have infants clinging to their tummies and there are juveniles playing all around them, and they're kind of like, you know, get out of here, we're having a great time. And in that clip, they're also laughing really, really hard too. So, you know, what that sort of summer showed us was that when food availability gets to this like really great threshold and you have this boon, it really unlocks sociality for females. And it's got really important implications for a lot of, you know, a lot of work originally by like Richard Wrangham and Carl von Schaick and Lynn Isbell, thinking about the socio-ecological model and how, you know, we have all these ideas about sociality, but sociality is so shaped by what's going on in the environment around chimps. And here's just another video of, this is Tongo, so this is my favorite female, playing with her, I think it's her daughter Thatcher. And so, you know, what you can see in this clip is that she's playing with her daughter Thatcher while her younger infant, Tangoese, is suckling. So she's really doing double duty here. And sort of another finding from the paper is, you know, we think that part of the reason that females wind up playing so often with their offspring in this sort of society is because they wind up spending time alone. So once food availability drops and they can't afford to be in groups that are a little bit bigger with other juveniles or infants around for their kiddos to play with, you know, they break off. They're spending more time by themselves with just their offspring, and their offspring, who really need to play because it's very important for their development, don't have anybody else except for their moms. So their moms sort of like slide into that role. And so the next steps that we want to take are like really sort of pulling that apart a little bit more. And seeing how moms play differently with, for instance, their younger versus older kiddos, or versus like with their sons versus their daughters, and start to pull apart the role of play. And like, you know, maybe it's just that they're leftover partners, or maybe there's something really specific about playing with your mother before you sort of expand toward playing with peers. And that's something that we see in humans. So it's possible that it could be true for chimps as well.
Well, before the episode, we played a clip, and let's play it again, of a group of chimpanzees gazing at something. And we asked our viewers to guess what they are gazing at. So if you haven't submitted what you think that this group of chimpanzees is gazing at, please do so now, and we'll take a look at the clip. It's really adorable. So we won't play the full 2 minutes that we had before the show, but let's take a look. Or I guess you want to tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, yeah. So two things that I love about this clip are, like, you know, as you're watching through it, there's the sort of smallest one in the frame who's sitting like right by the very front, and it almost looks like as everybody's watching this way, he almost like points in that direction, which is not something that like chimpanzees really do, but it just happens to be that like he lifted his arm at the perfect moment while they're all looking. So I love that about this clip. And then you can see, as you know, it's all sort of one like family lying beside each other on this trail. And then as the oldest female sort of approaches, you can almost see her sort of like, you can see how she almost looks at the juveniles at the last minute, right before she looks up. And actually what this highlights, oh, there's Tembo almost pointing, but he's not pointing. Chimps really don't do that in the wild. And you can see that right as Otamba is approaching, she had looked sort of toward Gola and Tenkeri right before looking toward what they're looking at. And what I really like about this clip is it highlights a couple of things. One is the potential for gaze following, which is something that we'll talk about a little bit more in a few seconds. But the other is that, especially when we play that video clip back with sound, what you can tell is how difficult, like what you can really easily see is how difficult it is to tell what is going on and what the stimulus is for exactly what is sort of going through Otamba's mind in that moment. And it really shows how, you know, she could be following, like she could be looking at Gola, seeing Gola looking, and then following her gaze. Or she could also be independently, like sort of observing the stimulus and hearing the stimulus and looking toward that. And so that really shows how important it is to use things like more controlled experimental paradigms where you're sort of ruling out some of those outside stimulus to figure out, what the cognitive abilities of chimpanzees are.
Well, let's take a look at what they were actually
Yes.
gazing at. We had several guesses. Most people thought that it was a bird that that they were looking at, which I could see, like, well, I guess, I was like, it could be an elephant, but like I think they'd probably be
Yeah.
more reactive than that. They probably wouldn't be just sitting and watching.
Yeah. I mean, you would be surprised, every once in a while when we do get close enough to elephants in the forest, like usually you'll smell them before you see them. But if there is that sort of motion, they will kind of act a bit like that. So in this clip, they're sort of like they're up high enough that they're not looking. So even though they're looking into the top of a tree, the sort of hill that they're on makes it so they're not looking too far up, which is why I think they have like just this great viewing platform. And essentially, what they're watching is so that's an adult male 2K in the tree, and he's making a bit of a ruckus. He's doing a lot of communication in that moment. So he's got his vocal communication that's telling a little bit of something about his mood, which seems maybe he's a little bit distressed. And then you can see he's doing that like perfect fear grimace that almost looks like a smile, but it isn't. So all of his teeth are showing, and you can see, like, as you're watching the clip, he even like periodically pulls them back even farther, again, to show that he's really uncomfortable with the adult male who was feeding right beside him. So, what you might be able to infer from those two things together is that he was really uncomfortable, and maybe he thought that there was going to be, a fight that would potentially break out between he and this other adult male, or, maybe we missed something. Maybe this other adult male did a little arm threat toward him or something like that. But yeah, he's got a lot of vocal and gestural communication telling you exactly how he feels. And then this whole family is basically watching, trying to figure out, putting together what happened. And they're observing the same things that I'm observing, and presumably like putting the same things together.
Well, you recently presented a poster on this research at the at AABA's. You tell us a little bit about your work.
Yeah, so this is a very exciting study that I did as a part of my postdoc with Zareen Mashanda and with Alex Rosati at the university, at UMesh. And we were like working on translating some, very cool experimental like wild applications or field applications, so that we could answer some questions about chimpanzee social cognition in the wild that we haven't been able to access before, and actually do this very, very cool big project combining, the things that we can do really well in sanctuaries and the things that we can do really well in the wild, and trying to get some crossover. And so this is one of those attempts. And we were, it's all toward a larger project, thinking about individual differences in behavior and leadership in chimpanzees. But here, what we were trying to do was sort of come up with an experimental paradigm. You can see my research assistant, Isabel Monroe, here doing a perfect example. So what we're doing is we're using a human observer as the stimulus, or sorry, I should say a human experimenter as the stimulus. And that stimulus helps us to control for a lot of the other types of signals that chimpanzees might be tuning into. So what she's doing is she is sort of moving her head around until she gains eye contact from Yogi, who unfortunately in this clip did not follow her gaze. So it's not like the perfect situation. But she's waiting until she gains eye contact from Yogi. And then at the moment that she does, she looks up. And so what you'll see in the experimental videos that I'm taking is a close-up of the face of the individual. And here's one where it did work out. So Isabel looked up and Tripoli followed her gaze. So Isabel looks up there, and you can see Tripoli sort of like checks in real quick and then looks all the way up. And so what we're doing is we're waiting until, there are no chimpanzees above them. There's nobody like 2K yelling in a tree nearby. Things are pretty relaxed. And then we set up this paradigm so that we can be sure that, they're following us. They're really doing the thing that we are hoping to test, with like ruling out as many confounding stimuli as possible. And the reason that this is really important and why we're interested in it is because we think of gaze following as one of these really foundational aspects of socio-cognitive ability, especially in humans. That's sort of like a first step to building more complex skills and more complex understandings about inferring others' intentions and being able to sort of like use social information in more complex ways that you're getting from other people. And in humans, it's a skill that that emerges really by about 6 months old. So very, very early in development. And there are lots of skills that scaffold from there. And then in captivity, we've seen that great apes and chimpanzees specifically can usually do this skill reliably by around 3 to 4 years old, so the end of infancy. But we didn't know what the development of the skill was in the wild. So we took it to the wild to confirm that we could sort of do this paradigm with wild apes, and to see when it emerges. And we found some pretty similar results. So by the end of infancy and into the juvenile phase and in adulthood, chimpanzees are pretty reliably looking up when we are looking up. And then just like humans. So here's another example of not following gaze. So you can see in this clip really clearly that Tinkeri is absolutely looking at us. She's looking at us for an extended period of time in the beginning of the clip, but she's not interested in what we're looking at. Oh, Ariel, are you muted?
Thank you.
We
already have a really great question from one of our viewers, Lori, who asks, by pointing by human children has a place in language development. Interesting to learn that chimps do not point. Can you elaborate on how they bring attention to something interesting or even dangerous? And for the rest of our viewers, we're going to be taking questions now. So please, if you've not submitted your question, get those questions in the chat.
So this is a great question. And another one where there's been a little bit of work done that's like experimental work in the field that can sort of speak to this, where what people have done, and or just like, what field primatologists do, is they set up a situation where you expose wild animals to something either like a little bit dangerous or a little bit scary. And so most of the time what we're doing with primates is we've got like a model snake, because everybody's afraid of snakes. Snakes are dangerous. And so we'll sort of plant a model snake in a place where we expect, in our case, wild chimpanzees to come across them. And then we wait to see what the chimpanzees do. And we usually film things like this so that we can get really detailed information about where they're looking, who they're looking toward, what sort of vocal signals they're making, and the order that all these things are happening. And so when it comes to something scary like a snake, something dangerous, usually what you might hear are alarm calls that sound a bit like, we call them wah barks, or like any sort of bark. So they sort of sound like the top of that pan hoot, where it's like wah wah, and they can be quite intense. And you'll also hear sometimes like a little bit, maybe even something like a scream, like what 2K was doing, where it's like, you can tell that they're not in some like really horrible fight, but there's an arousal happening. And so they will share information that way. And then I've also seen things where, like one individual will walk up toward the snake and they'll look at the snake. And then when another chimpanzee is approaching, they might look toward their friends and then back at the snake. And so I think they share much more subtle forms of like shared attention or joint attention than, than something as obvious as like pointing. And it's really very, very interesting because we can start to think about, like, we can use what we're seeing with chimpanzees to start thinking about like where those skills came from and where, what the development of these sorts of things are in humans as well. It's a great question. Thank you for asking that.
Yeah, so we had a follow up by Sears James. Basically, he was just saying that was what that was what I wanted to know. Do they use their heads, move their heads forward to point and make some sort of noises to draw attention, which is very, very similar. Our next question comes from Pete. Do geographically separated groups make the same calls?
Yes. The short answer on that is yes. Like, and I will also say, like, there are, like, chimpanzee vocal communication is complex enough that there are entire labs of people who are dedicated to like figuring out these questions. And that is not my area of specific expertise. But generally speaking, yes. They might use, like, it's possible that calls will be used in like slightly different combinations. So one thing that's actually really interesting, as I think Zareen said this in her clip about pant hoots, is that you can sometimes tell different individuals by their pant hoots. So there's some really interesting individual differences in sort of voices and the cadences that individual chimps will use while they're pant hooting. But generally speaking, it's the same sort of set of calls in all groups. So everybody's, when alarm calls, no matter where you are, alarm calls are pretty similar. Pant hoots are pretty similar. Like like anywhere that you're with chimps, you're going to hear pant hoots.
We have a question from Instagram that we collected previously from Toucan Sam 93, who asks, in your opinion, what are the biggest pros and cons of being a primatologist?
Okay, so the biggest pros are that, honestly, I'm absolutely one of those that thinks that this is the best job in the world for me. It is the things that I love the most about it are being able to spend as much time outside as possible, getting to like really, really intimately know like another place, another ecology, and to know so much about one area and the animals that are living in it is like something that I really, really highly value. And from a career perspective, I kind of love everything about being a primatologist and being an academic primatologist from top to bottom. So I love talking to the public about primates and about chimpanzees. I love lecturing. I love doing all the sort of audiovisual work of putting talks together and dissemination. I love the analysis. I love writing. I love reading about chimpanzees. And I love that it's a job that lets me just like let my nerd flag fly and really be committed to it. So those are all pros for me. And it's something that obviously I'm sure you can tell from what I just said that I'm pretty passionate about it. The cons will always be the job market. I mean, it's really tough it can be really tough to get all the way through to a tenured position. And that's true like for all sorts of academic jobs right now. But yeah, I would say it's a highly individualized situation as well. Like, what's perfect about it for me might not be perfect about it for a lot of other people. It's just like, honestly, it's like everything I love in one job. And I don't know how I got so lucky as to find it. So yeah, that's my 2 cents on it.
Well, thank you so much for your comprehensive answers to the questions and for giving us, that brief snapshot of your different research projects. We're going to actually try something new on lunch break today. So we're going to like officially end our episode now. And if you hang around till after the credits, we're going to actually be answering all of your questions. So please stay tuned. So again, Kris, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It was a blast, as always.
And thank you all for taking a break from your day and feeding your brain with the Leaky Foundation. And also hang around till after the credits for your answers to be question other way around. Questions be answered. Until next time, stay hungry for knowledge. Lunch Break Science is brought to you by the Leaky Foundation and made possible by the generous support of the Ann and Gordon Getty Foundation, Camilla and George Smith, and the Joan and Arnold Travis Education Fund, as well as viewers like you. Show your support of Lunch Break Science by subscribing to our channel, clicking on notifications, and giving us a thumbs up, or making a donation to help us create new content. Still craving science and can't wait for the next episode? You can feast on the Leaky Foundation's content library with past episodes, lectures, our podcast origin stories, and more. Thank you all for tuning in, and see you next time. So, welcome to our post-show unanswered questions segment. So we have a bunch of questions we actually got submitted from Instagram. So we'll be tackling those next. Let's take the first one, I think is from Tom Westenden. Do we have it? Okay, I'll just read it. What are the evolutionary and behavioral factors that might explain the development of complex social structures in primate species such as chimpanzees and bonobos? Which I feel like that is like,
how much time do we have?
I know, right? That's like a whole nother episode, but
Yeah.
you know, a brief recap, you know.
Okay, here we go. In 30 seconds or less. Okay. So actually, would it be okay to pop that question back up just so I can see the wording of it a little bit? So I think that,
Absolutely.
right, what are the evolutionary and behavioral factors? Okay. So I think a couple of things are really important here. Like from an evolutionary perspective, I mentioned with that play study that ecology is really, really important. So, one thing that happens often when we think about like doing shorter term studies, or often even with like dissertation studies, you might be out there with primates for 1 year. And if you are out there in the field and it happens to be a great year and there's tons of food and there's tons of water and everything's fantastic, you're going to get a different impression compared to the person that goes next year and there's a drought, or, basically the equivalent of like a primate famine. You're going to see a lot of different sort of things. You might not see adult play, and you might think that, maybe adults are never playing in chimpanzees if you're there during, a particularly tough year. Or, the summer that inspired this study, our chimpanzees really didn't even fission. They were together all summer long. So there were really no subgroups. It was like all the chimps were together all the time. And so if you were there, doing your, first work or trying to write a whole study, and you were only there during that window, you might, think, weird. Everyone says this is a fission fusion species, but it's super cohesive and they've been together all summer long. And so that's all to say that ecology is really, really important. And ecology is a very important part of shaping sociality. And so that's one thing. And then the other thing is that, of course, there are lots of different ways to solve a problem, especially when you have when what you're building with is already a relatively complex sort of mammal that has a lot of cognitive skills. And so, yeah, I would say, I think the very, very short answer is ecology and ecological change over time. This is where I would probably go if I had to boil it down.
So our next question comes from Instagram, and Faye asks, do you think that there's a difference between humans and animals? If yes, what is the difference, and how can you see this analyzing by human and monkey behavior as primates, our closest living relatives?
Yeah. I mean, these are great. These are fantastic questions. So yes and no. So I think that there are differences between humans and other animals. And you'll notice whenever I talk about it, I say humans and other animals, because to me, I think that sort of dichotomy is misplaced, saying that, linguistically separating us from other animals is cognitively that I'm very sort of cognizant of. And so in terms of thinking about what makes us different from other animals, I think one thing that's been really, really clear to me and becoming more clear as I spend more time in the field and I spend more time as a part of this discipline is, going back through history, there have been all these things that we thought made us so different, like using tools or building structures or complex language, or even some of the sort of socio-cognitive things like gaze following that I mentioned earlier. That was one of those skills that we used to think only humans could do. And so in searching for this like uniquely human thing that makes us different from all the other animals, I don't know if you can boil it down to like one thing or two things. To me, it seems to be a question of degree, right? So there are lots of really smart animals, but we're sort of extreme in that degree. There are lots of animals that use tools, but we're sort of extreme in that degree. And so that's how I sort of separate them. And I think what makes there are lots of other animals besides primates that are really fantastic models for figuring out the ways that we do things. Like, so for instance, we like humans are really, really good at solving collective action problems or doing things as a really big group. And so sometimes, even looking to social insects might be a really good comparison for figuring out questions about humans, because they're the ones who are the most like us in those regards. Or I think for, questions about teaching, we don't see human primates or non-human primates doing very much that resembles the sort of active teaching that we do as humans. But, meerkats or mongooses, oh shoot, now I can't remember if it's meerkats or mongooses. So I'll have to fact check myself on this. But either meerkats or mongooses do this sort of thing where what they'll do is the adults will sort of like damage scorpions. So they'll like chop off the poisonous end, like the barb on a scorpion's tail, and then sort of let little ones figure out how to sort of deal with that predation situation in a less dangerous situation. So they're giving up their own food and they're making it easier for the kids. So that's something that's much more like human teaching. So we might be able to use them in comparison to learn more about human teaching than we could with some primates. But with the great apes especially, I think what's really, really great is that we can figure out lots of questions about how we came to be behaviorally and biologically and physiologically at the same time, because they are so closely related to us and their lifespans are so similar to ours. And a lot of, for me, I'm really interested in hormonal development and how hormones are related to behavior and how that changes over time. And so, for instance, like there's a developmental phase called adrenarche. And adrenarche happens before puberty, and it marks the completed maturation of the adrenal gland. And that is something that could have really big effects. It's associated with like middle childhood. And it could have really big effects on behavior. And we really only see a pattern like that in humans, bonobos, and chimpanzees. It's even not quite the same in gorillas, and it doesn't seem to be quite the same in orangutans. So like that's something that's really important and unique and has, important physiological implications, important health implications, important behavioral implications. And that, I think, to me, is why I really love using great apes as like a model for figuring out human evolution, because I don't think that we are different from the animals in a categorical way. I think that we can learn a lot about ourselves from comparing ourselves to other animals.
I just want to do a quick shout out to Mike, Lori, Clover, and Jennifer. Thank you. I don't know if you're still watching, but thank you for tuning in. And again, if anyone has any other questions, like please get them in. We have a few that we are tackling before the episode ends. So while we still have Kris with us, get those questions in. Our next question, let's see here. Ooh, I can't see. There we go. Lindsay from Instagram asks, how do I get a job studying primates?
Well, you start by, you can go, it depends on how and what you want to do. So if you want to be working in the wild, you probably want a degree in biology, psychology can sort of get you there as well. Anthropology, so biological anthropology or evolutionary anthropology. So that's where primatology is usually situated. And it depends on what kind of job you want to have with primates and what kind of studies you want to do. So if you want to do something like what I do, so where I'm in the wild, I'm measuring behavior, I'm measuring ecology, those are the sorts of degrees that you would look for. And then you would also want experience. So there are a couple of places where you can find like jobs as research assistants in the wild, jobs as like even like field managers, things like that in the wild. Now, aside from that, there are lots of opportunities to work with captive primates. So especially, I mentioned psychology can sort of get you toward field primatology. Psychology, like there are lots of psychological studies and cognitive studies that are focused in on, zoo housed or sanctuary housed primates. And that can be one way to study primates. And then, of course, there are zookeepers who do a lot of like evidence-based work and are starting to do research within zoo spaces now. There are even welfare scientists who are working with laboratory primates. Like there are lots and lots of ways. I mean, and that's not even like there's conservation style jobs with NGOs where what you might be doing is instead of being in the field all the time, you're bringing data together and using big data to help sort of inform conservation plans and things like that. So there are lots of ways that you can study primates.
Oh, or you can be like me and vicariously study them through
yes,
through our lunch break science guests. We have a great question from Lori, who's a bioanth student, which is actually Kris and I were chatting about this the other day. Does the visible scalera of the primary figure affect gaze following?
Excellent question, and an open one. So there's a lot of variation across chimpanzees, like individual variation across chimpanzees in how visible sclera are. So some chimpanzees, there's a recent paper that came out of a neighboring group in Kibale National Park called Ngogo, sort of quantifying that variation and showing that, some individuals do have very white sclera, others don't. But we're not sure if there's any very intense functional significance. So there have been some eye tracking studies that have shown that, humans tend to look at the eyes and the eyes alone. And even though, even in the mouth, but even though chimpanzees can use eye direction and face direction and head direction to follow gaze, and they can do this with conspecific, so with other chimpanzees, and they can do it with humans. And this is all from experimental captive studies. They tend to look more at, I think, different parts of the face compared to humans. And that's presumably partly because, their white sclera isn't quite as prominent as ours. So we do think that, that our white sclera has something to do with, or has evolved to help us understand each other and communicate with each other a little bit better. But the question of, how that functions in the wild with chimpanzees is pretty open right now. I mean, in our experimental paradigm, we were using the eyes and the head as like a first step. So our movement looks more like this. So I get eye contact, or Isabel would get eye contact, and then we would look up like this. So it's like the whole head following. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting question about whether there are some like underlying differences in either, the signaler. So am I more likely to follow somebody's gaze if they have white sclera, or if they have whiter sclera, we'll say. Or also there could be some sort of underlying difference in the receiver, the person, or the chimpanzee receiving the signal, seeing the signal. So yeah, open question, very interesting one.
So our next question comes from Colin. Do you have a favorite story from Kibale?
From the experiments that I've done at Kibale? Yes, I have a lot. I think, okay, but what I will tell you, I mean, there are some So I've been involved in some experiments that are like the snake experiment. And we've done some experiments with things like novel objects. And so what I'll do is I will tease about that and tell you that I have some great videos that we can talk about when those studies get published. But for gaze following, actually, I think one of my very, very favorite memories was, it's really, really hard to get this sort of data, because it's kind of like all the most difficult things about doing it in captivity and all the most difficult things about working in the wild are like coming together, right? Because you're in the wild dealing with difficult terrain and you're following chimpanzees and you have to keep your eyes on them and keep track of them and, make sure you've got the right one in the right place at the right time. And then you have to have all these separate conditions. So it's not just like, most of the time when I was doing my dissertation work, it was just about keeping my eyes on the right chimpanzee and making sure I knew where they were at all times, which is, again, hard enough. But so this time, what we had to do was get like the right chimp on the right day, in the right time, at the right mood where everybody's relaxed. And, Yogi here is making it look so easy. And we took these experimental sort of example videos toward the end when we had already gotten enough of the actual experimental data that, we could waste an opportunity to get real data and actually show what we were trying to do. But the very first one that we got happened to be, so what we did is like half the time we look up and half the time we look down, and like down at the ground. And what we're trying to confirm is that the chimps are more likely to look up when we look up. And the very first trial that we did, where we did look up, the chimp happened to also look up. And it was after chasing them for days, not being able to get in the right position. We would finally get ready and then like a fight would break out or something dramatic would happen. And so when we finally got this first one, and it completely anecdotally, like it could have been the only one that like went the way we might hope it would go. But just the fact that like we looked up and she looked up, it was like just so exciting. And it finally felt like, oh my God, maybe we could do this. And so that was a really great memory from this study, especially. And it was the first successful experiment of all of these sort of experiments that we were trying to do during this field season. So it was just like, whew, and it felt so good. So Isabel and I like high-fived, we hugged, we were so excited.
Well, like now that you've teased us, now you definitely let us know, because everyone's gonna want to know what it is, and you've always got such great videos. So, yeah, we'll definitely.
Well, yeah, I will tell you the videos of the snake experiment are pretty good. Like they're very interesting to watch, and the videos of the novel objects are also very interesting to watch. So it's been just like, I feel so privileged that I even get to study chimpanzees at all, but to be allowed to be involved in this type of really groundbreaking work to me and things that I've been excited about for so long. It's just, I just feel so lucky that I get to do this.
Well, we have one last question, which is actually like linked to a upcoming episode that we're working on developing, which is we were thinking of having different scientists on, giving their like a show and tell of their top 10 top pack list items. So Sears James, like you were clairvoyant, because you asked what type of studying tools do you take with you into the field?
Well, for me, I'm sure you can tell by everything we've talked about this whole episode, the number one thing for me is a good video camera. And for me, what a good video camera needs to be is like something that, sure, I can shoot in HD, I can shoot in 4K, but it needs to be like very durable. And it needs to be small enough that it can really like sort of easily fit in my pack or easily be around my neck. And usually what I do is, if a backpack, so that's I'll say tied for number one is a really good backpack, right? You need to have a good backpack. You need to have good rain gear. But beyond that, I need a video camera. And I like to have one that fits really nicely in like where a water bottle holder would go. And so what I do is I like put it in a dry bag in that pocket, because often we're going through sort of places where I need both hands, and I can't have it out all the time. And so for me, that's the most important thing. And then I have a secondary camera that is in like an SLR for taking photographs and getting photographic data. And it also works as like a backup video camera if I need it. So beyond that those are like sort of my most important things. I think like universally any primatologist is like good pack, the right boots. And then for me, my sort of secret weapon is I work in a place where we need to iron our clothes because there are some parasitic flies that like to lay their eggs in your wet clothes. And when they do that, like if you don't iron your clothes and you put them on, they'll transfer to your skin and you'll get these like boils, and they're a bit like, bot flies would be like the sort of colloquial term for them. And they're not great and they're not fun and they can wind up in terrible places. So we have to iron all of our clothes. And so what that means is that a lot of the sort of stuff that you might get at REI, that's like lightweight, great hiking clothes, I can't really wear in the field. So the thing that I've discovered that I was introduced to the first time I was an RA in Costa Rica by Dr. Elizabeth Eady is scrubs in the field. So I wear scrubs and they are fantastic, like scrub pants. And they're amazing because, especially as a woman, we always have problems with pockets not being big enough. The pockets are always perfect on scrubs. They dry so quickly. They usually have a drawstring. So, whatever happens with body size and weight fluctuations can usually be accommodated by scrubs. And so to me, like that is the other most important thing because I can fit everything in them. They're easy to iron. They're great.
Well, thank you so much for, again, answering all of the questions. Oh, we have one. I do have to say, like, I'm really curious. Pete asks, it seems like a short one. Are chimpanzees scared of snakes from birth?
This is such a great question.
It is. I'm like, I saw that. Thank you, Pete.
Okay. So let me tell you about chimpanzees and snakes. And this isn't necessarily true for all species. I've also seen capuchin sea snakes, and capuchin monkeys are really famous for mobbing snakes. So they'll like sort of come together, be above them, and like throw things at the snake until the snake goes away. And so what I will say is that it seems in the case of chimpanzees, they are aware of the snakes. They are, I would say they're more like healthfully respectful of the snakes than really afraid of them. Like if they get surprised by a snake, they might have like a jump scare. But there are a lot of chimps that'll sort of keep their eyes on the snake. So I've seen them in the experimental situations, and I've also seen them naturally come upon a snake. And that was one of the coolest things that's ever happened to me in the field. Because in that sort of situation, we had a couple of adult males who came upon the snake. They made wah barks and stood around making wah barks sort of at the snake and looking at each other. And a number of other group members also came. What wound up happening is after everybody knew where the snake was, everyone just kind of chilled out. So everybody sat down, they were grooming each other. There were a couple of individuals that were not really young infants, but they were like, 3-4 years old, and they were cautious and they didn't get very close to the snake, but they were still like curious enough and were getting information from what was going on. So it's not like a situation where they're so scared that they can't control themselves and they have to run away. It's like they have that moment of being like, whoof, and then they want to know more about the situation. And it's really, really fascinating to watch. And the best part about that experience actually is that's the one thing you might not know about vipers, and is that they often wind up in like sort of mated pairs that have close overlapping territories. And after we found the first snake, which was like just this, I also really love snakes. So that's another thing. Like this drop dead gorgeous rhinoceros viper. And we hung out with the first snake for a while. And then the males pretty much went directly to the second snake. And so we got to see 2 snakes that day, and we got to watch their reactions to both of them. And it was just very cool. So yes, they notice them. They're wary of them. They're not terrified of them. And in the experimental stuff, what I've seen is that the young ones will they're approaching on their mom's back because most of the time they're riding their mothers around until they're around 4 or 5 years old. So when they're approaching on their mom's back, and they spend a lot of time looking at it. They're very curious about it, and they're nervous enough that they don't dismount very often and go by themselves. But I'd say they're curious and cautious from a very young age. And this is even true in captivity where they might not have seen very many snakes before.
Well, thank you for answering all of our viewer questions. And thank you all out there for submitting such amazing questions. We'll see you next time on Lunch Break Science. And just thank you all. And see you next time.
Thanks so much for having me, Ariel.